So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sarah Spooner, who's going to talk to us about it. Sarah very kindly volunteered to come and give this talk when she heard about the plight of the meadow, and we're absolutely delighted to have her here tonight. So thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you all very much for giving up your Friday evening to come and listen to me. As some of you know, I grew up in Chatteris, so when I heard about the proposed development, it's something that's still dear to my heart, that part of the town. So I lived down, my parents still do live down there on Wenny Road. So that's why I volunteered to come and talk for Hillary and do some work for the campaign. So I now live in Norwich and I work at the University of East Anglia. We do landscape history at the UEA, which is a combination of history, of geography, of archaeology. So we look at historic buildings, veteran trees, hedgerows, parks and gardens, like Wenny Meadows, and everything above ground that is historical is basically what landscape history is all about. And we use it as a means of finding out what people's lives were like in the past, what they thought, how they were shaped by the landscapes that were around them. So that's what I do every day at UEA with our other research staff and all of our undergraduate and postgraduate students. And my particular research specialism has become the English country house and its park and its garden, which is of course what Wenny Meadows is, on a relatively small scale, but still an important example of an early 19th century park, which is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So we're going to be ranging all over the place. I've got lots of other examples of similar places from around the country to show you, to try and set this bit of historic landscape in context. So here it is, Wenny Meadows, which I'm sure you all know very, very well, on a modern area photograph with a manor house over here, and this is the area of parkland out back. Here it is in 1888. This is the Ordnance Survey 25-inch map, which is one of the best maps ever made of the British Isles, and because it's so detailed. When the surveyors were going around, they had instructions to accurately record the location of every tree that had a diameter or circumference bigger than that. So it's one of the most detailed maps of Britain ever made. Most of the whole country is now online if anyone wants to waste an evening of their lives zooming around through the National Library of Scotland. And here we can see the manor house set within its park, then right on the edge of town and without the later development that's gone on around it.
Can I just ask how long it took them to do that survey?
Oh, years. They start
they're doing every tree.
in 1843 and they don't finish until sometime in the 1890s. And then they decide so much has changed, of course, second half of the 19th century, that they go back and start all over again. Isn't that tragic for them, I think? They get a bit bogged down in Ireland as well, because it's the whole of Ireland as well as Scotland, Wales and England. So it's just a mammoth undertaking. There's a brilliant book about it by Rachel Hewitt called Map of a Nation, which is well worth a read if you're interested. Sorry, tangent. So here it is in the 1880s. It's a pretty typical park. I mean, I've seen it called, obviously now we generally refer to it as Wenny Meadows. When I was little, it used to be called the Manor Fields. I've seen it referred to in documents as Chatteris Park and the Manor Park as well. So it has all of these different names over the course of the 19th century. But at heart, it is a pretty typical landscape park of the late 18th, early 19th century. It's a bit of a close-up, and it has all the typical things that we would expect to find around a manor house or even a big country house of that period. I should just sneak in here by the table. The house with out the back, it's outbuildings, stables, gardeners' buildings, things like that. Over here is the kitchen garden, which was walled, and we know it's the kitchen garden because it's quite hard to make out on this screen. But that little building there is crosshatched on the map, which indicates that it's a glass house. So pretty obvious sign that that's the kitchen garden. A little area of garden close to the house, and then the park itself with It's scattered trees, really typical for a landscape park of this period, and a felt plantation along the edge of the road, which is still there, of course, when you drive into Chatteris from that direction. That's what you see as soon as you're coming into the town. And of course, the ice house, which is actually quite an unusual feature to find in a park of this size in that period. So I'm going to talk, there's a house, a little bit about all of those things in a bit more detail later on. And I want to talk about why parks are important in this period, why this one is interesting and important, and try and set it in a little bit of context. So there's a house which is, no one's really too sure of the date, late 18th century, early 19th century. It's really typical of that period. Again, there's a little glass house in the background. Here's the entrance to the ice house, which is now in Parkside. You would have gone in, there's a well inside, a deep, well, I've got a slide of this later on, where you would have stored the ice collected and then kept it over the summer months for the kitchen. Quite where they're getting the ice from isn't entirely clear, because normally when you find them in a landscape park, you find them next to the lake or something, or the river or something like that. So they must presumably be getting it off the fen, off the drainage ditches. But there are examples in 18th and 19th century texts of them collecting snow. Even in a really heavy frost, they will go out and collect the ice and things like that to store it in the ice house. This is a photo which I'd never seen before I started doing this work for Hilary, of the outbuildings in the mid-1950s out the back. And outbuildings of this date are designed to be functional, but they're also designed to be decorative and make a pleasing view from the house. And of course here, the outbuildings are in between the house and the park, so they would have formed part of the view. And it's got this extraordinary building with this glass cupola on top, which is really interesting, I think. And I think that's the bit that's now gone, and some of the other ranges survive. There's the shelter belt, the park belt alongside Wenny Road. There's a great photo, which is about 1900-ish, I think, which is really interesting because the trees, as they appear in this photo, must have been about 80 years old when this photo was taken. We'll come on to that later on. So they're reaching maturity at about that period. And plantations along the edges of parks are really, really typical of the 18th and 19th centuries. And we'll come back to that again later on, as are all the scattered trees across the park itself. Now, this is obviously not Wenny Meadows. This is Holkham up on the North Norfolk coast. I just wanted to talk for a couple of minutes about parks and country houses and manor houses in this period, because Wenny Meadows is part of a design philosophy, I suppose, which united the landed elite in the 18th and 19th centuries. As soon as you made all your money, or you inherited all your money, or you married somebody with a lot of money, what you wanted was a big house with one of these parks around it. They all look very similar, loads of grass, scattered trees, shelter belts around the outside, sometimes clumpy plantations in the middle of them. Holkham, of course, has a great avenue where you drove in and up to the house. They have kitchen gardens, they have stable blocks. Holkham, of course, has a beautiful ice house thatched near the lake. So all the stuff that we find in Wenny Meadows, we also find on some of the scale of Holkham, which is hundreds and hundreds of acres. You could fit the whole of Chatteris into the park at Holkham. It's so big. But if you put the Earl of Leicester down in Wenny Meadows, or you picked up the Dungardeners who create Wenny Meadows and put them down in Holkham, they would both have understood what that landscape was all about, how it worked, why it was there, and what it meant to them, and what it said about them politically, socially. So we find landscape parks on enormous scales like this, and we find them absolutely everywhere. This is a map of the location of all the parks and gardens in Georgian England. From county maps made between about 1715 and about 1790. It's unfinished, because I started it before I had my first baby. And I haven't picked it up since. I've had another one since then. So there's no chance I'm going to finish now for about 18 years, I should say. But you can see they are thickly scattered over eastern England. And if you can pick out where the major cities are, you get hundreds of them packing in around London. Liverpool up here, Norwich, you can see has a big cluster around it. Plymouth down here, because as soon as anyone living in a town or a city makes a stack of money in the 18th, 19th centuries, they move out to the edges and build themselves a little villa. So the dots on this map represent places like Holkham, which are hundreds of acres. They might be places which are just tens of acres, and everywhere in between. This is a kind of medium-sized one on the scale of Wenny Meadows in Chatteris. This is Catton Park on the northern edge of Norwich, which is about 1780s, but it's very similar with the house at one end, scattered trees, plantation belts all the way around. So we find them all over the place. And of course, this one is now engulfed by later development that is now public park. Here are some more from the air. They are recognisable. This is Holkham Hall, again with the house, scattered trees, shelter belts, and this is Brancaster Hall, right up on the North Norfolk coast, which is just a field. They've put a shelter belt around the edge, and they've got a little garden planted up in the middle and an entrance lodge at one end. This kind of design trickles down the social scale until by the late 19th century, a big farm might have a little designed park-like landscape around it. So it's a style which unifies the elite in that Georgian period, really. And that's partly why they are important. But there are a whole host of other reasons why they're important. The first one, as I've suggested, is the way that it helps us understand the social and cultural history of the 18th and 19th century. So, of course, when you're studying country houses, their parks, their gardens, that inevitably means the rich. This is Edward Parker and his wife, with absolutely nothing to do with Chatteris. I couldn't find a lovely portrait of the Dunn Gardens or anyone posing in their landscape, but that's exactly the kind of thing that they would have had in mind. You know, you have your portrait painted with your house and your grounds in the background. So it helps us understand high society, and of course these people are really powerful. They are hugely wealthy landlords who have a big impact on the lives of their tenants and the people living in the rest of the countryside. But it also helps us understand the social and cultural history of local communities in the 18th and 19th century. And I see Mark's got this photo over on the board over there as well. These are men cutting the hay in the Manor Park in Wenny Meadows in Chatteris in 1916. So people live next to these parks, they work within them, they might be entertained within them by the lord of the manor if they're having a fete or the children's tea on a harvest Sunday or something like that. So they're important not just for the rich and the history of the wealthy, but for the history of everybody else in the community as well. Parks are important in archaeological terms because they preserve early archaeology within them. Because they're laid down to pasture, of course the grass is really important to the wealthy elite in the 18th century. They're never ploughed again, so earlier archaeology survives really, really well. And actually when you're looking at where lots of interesting archaeological sites are, deserted medieval villages, the remains of former farming systems, things like that, prehistoric archaeology, barrows and that kind of thing, often find them in parks because that's where they survived. So this, of course, isn't Wenny Meadows, it's Chatsworth, but I've put it in here as an illustration of the scale of surviving archaeology that you can find in parks. Chatsworth is absolutely covered in ridge-and-furrow earthworks, the earthworks of medieval strip cultivation, which of course we find in Chatteris as well. As well at Chatsworth, there's loads of field boundaries, which we also find in Wenny Meadow. So even though it's much smaller, nowhere near as grand as Chatsworth, it has something in common with those really well-known internationally significant sites. They are also, as well as preserving earlier archaeology, historians, archaeologists, bodies like Historic England, English Heritage as well, consider landscapes like this as important archaeological landscapes monuments in their own right. You know, the grass is important, the trees are important and deserve to be recorded archaeologically. And that's why we now find that so many parks and gardens of this period are registered parks and gardens, a bit like listed buildings, although of course Wenny Meadows is not. So that's why parks are important. I'm going to go back a couple of steps and talk about the Dung Gardens and how they create the park in the first place in the late 18th, early 19th century. Now, many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with both of these buildings. The Manor House and Chatteris House, which they built later on in the 1820s, which was always a source of fascination for me when I was little, when it was still the Indian restaurant. And some of you may remember that series that was filmed there, ages ago. It was on the telly, which seemed terribly exciting at the time. Both built by the Dung Gardeners, who are wealthy attorneys, businessmen, farmers, landlords in Chatteris in the late 18th, early 19th century. And I think it's William Dunn marries Jane Gardner. I think that's the right way around. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. And they go double barrel, which is quite nice. They have one daughter, Sarah Dunn Gardner, who's well known for marrying the Marquess Townsend in 1807, who's the heir of the Earl of Leicester, at Holkham, in fact. And the marriage, as I'm sure some of you will have heard this story, is a disaster and only lasts a year. And she runs off and has a bigamous marriage with somebody from St Ives instead, and loads of children with him, and not the Earl of Leicester. But it's her parents, William and Jane, who creates the park. And there are not many good early detailed maps of Chatteris, which is a shame in many ways. This is one of the earliest that we know of. This is the Ordnance Survey drawing, when they're doing the very first survey from about 1790 to about 1820. They come to the Fens in about 1810, and this is the Chatteris sheet. And if I zoom in, there it is, the town, still with the great commons unenclosed at that point, it's 1810. And this is the area of the park down here, which shows the house, the manor house, already in existence, but doesn't show the park as yet. Although that, as we'll see in a minute, is slightly debatable. This is the next and more detailed map in the sequence. This is the Parliamentary Enclosure map of Chatteris, which is also sometimes known as the tithe map, because the tithes were done away with at the same time that Chatteris was enclosed back. And this is about 1820. You can see the house really clearly over here, with its outbuildings and area of the park, Wenny Meadows. Most of it coloured in green. And what that means is the green areas on this map are areas that have already been enclosed before the Act of Parliament. So the only bit of Wenny Meadows which is actually enclosed by Act of Parliament is this bit here, which is allotted to William Dunn Gardner, Esquire, and Jane, his wife. I'll come back to this map and why it's interesting in a minute. There it is, superimposed on that 1880s Ordnance Survey map. It might be a bit hard to see. Try. How's that? Better? Don't fall asleep. Now I turned off the lights on. You can see how that line of trees lines up with one of those field boundaries shown on that Parliamentary Enclosure map of 1820. And it's really typical when they're making a park in this period, if you're dealing with old enclosures, to just whip the hedgerows out and leave the trees as they are. So parks preserve, as well as earlier archaeology, they also preserve trees which are much older than the park itself. Now here are some enclosure commissioners at work. This is Henslow in Bedfordshire on their map with their surveying chains. And I just wanted to say a bit about parliamentary enclosure and why it's important in the context of Wenny Meadows and making parks. And parliamentary enclosure, there are many forms of enclosure, but parliamentary enclosure takes place in the 18th and the 19th centuries and is really aimed at getting rid of what is left of the medieval open field systems that are still in existence, which are very, very complicated beasts. Here is one on a Northamptonshire estate map. This is Ecton in 1703, which shows one of these open field systems still in operation, with 3 or 4 great fields around the village, all divided up into little strips. Each person is allotted strips equally across the open fields, and they all have common rights as well, which is all tangled up with that, to graze their animals on fallow strips at any time of the year. The 3 or 4 great fields are farmed in common, everybody pulling together. By the 18th, 19th century, they are not so interested in communal-based agricultural systems anymore, all tied up with the emerging capitalist economy that starts to happen in the 18th century. Farmers want to do their own thing and they don't want to farm strip fields with their neighbours anymore. But these systems are very entrenched. They're very much based on medieval systems of farming and traditions and customs dating back centuries. So it's very hard for farmers in an open field system like this in the 18th, 19th century to get rid of it, to dismantle it. So an Act of Parliament is required, and parliamentary enclosure commissioners are brought in to do it for them. The land is surveyed, a map is produced showing existing enclosures, showing existing open field strips that have survived, and all of that is almost taken back in by the enclosure commissioners and then redistributed and reallotted. So your land in the strip fields, you might have 10, 12, 20 strips strewn around the parish, will be consolidated into one parcel of land. And that, for big landowners, is an opportunity to make a park. And we find a huge explosion in the number of parks being created after Parliamentary Enclosure Act. This is the broad national chronology of parliamentary enclosure. It happens in 2 waves in the mid to late 18th century, from about 1750 to about 1780, and then again during the period of the Napoleonic Wars, when they're particularly interested in enclosing things like upland moors, heaths, and things like that. When they're being blockaded by the French, food supplies are not coming in. It's almost like an enormous 19th century dig for victory campaign, because they just want to plough everything up and start producing food. So Chatteris falls into this period in the 1820s with its enclosure. And obviously, some of it has already been enclosed, which is typical, and the rest is divided up and reallotted at that point. If we go back to Ecton, here it is in 1703 with this gorgeous illustration of a 17th century country house with its formal garden around it, and the church, and all surrounded by all the strips, and the green bits are old enclosures, just like on the Chatteris enclosure map. And it will come as no surprise in 1750 that this is what they made, a landscape park. So the house that was on that map is just up here, and this is the church over here, and all of this bit on that 1703 map is old enclosures, but also all of these strip fields as well. Their new consolidated holding allows them to make a landscape park. In this case, possibly designed by the most famous 18th century landscape designer, Capability Brown. You know, these kinds of people see enclosure as an opportunity to create a park. So where does that leave us in Chatteris? Well, I think this map is really interesting, because they're not getting loads and loads of land and enclosure, because most of it has already been enclosed on the site of the park. So they're getting this little bit here, which is called Broadacre Field. What that may mean is that the park already halfway to existence by the time this map is made in 1820. If you look carefully, some of the little shapes of that little field up there, I can't quite reach it, and that long enclosure down there, which I think is number 480, they are plantations on the later maps. And the map of Chatteris shows no trees, no detail whatsoever, so we don't know what is in those old enclosures in 1820. I think that they're already starting on the park, and they're finishing it off when they get this little bit here, and then they plant the belt alongside Wenny Road. What we know is that it must be pasture on this map because of the survival of the ridge-and-furrow earthworks within the park. As soon as those hedgerows around all those little fields shown on there went up, those fields were taken out of cultivation and put down to grass. And it suggests very strongly to me, and there are lots of other examples like it, that this is a phase where you're starting to see a landscape park emerge just before enclosure, and then they're using the enclosure as an opportunity to finish it off. So there it is, in its finished form. With loads of trees. Most of those field boundaries, which are shown in 1820s, have been removed. But whether they're all there in 1820 is a moot point. Some of those hedge lines, some of those field boundary lines are preserved in the rows of trees. And what is really interesting about Wenny Meadows, one of the many interesting things, is that this design with the belt alongside Wenny Road, the scattered trees, we know the ice house is early 19th century, so probably around the time that the enclosure is taking place. It then doesn't seem to change very much at all until the relatively recent past, when the houses are built around the periphery. And actually, the modern aerial photographs and the landscape on the ground, it's still relatively unchanged from the 1820s. And that's quite unusual to find something so unchanging across about 200 years. Usually we find lots more changes. That's not to say there haven't been any, of course. So the parkland planting is really important, the scattered trees inside, the perimeter belt as well, which must be post-enclosure because they only get that field that they're allotted at enclosure, which allows them to plant it up. There's that picture again. Here's the ice house again. The well inside has been filled in, but it would originally have been quite deep so that the ice is kept underground to allow them to keep it cold. But the important thing in a landscape park is that mixture of grass and trees, which is really characteristic of somebody like Capability Brown, somebody like Humphry Repton, who I'll come on to later. That's the aesthetic that they are going for in this period, and it's very consciously designed. The trees, the newly planted trees, are placed just so to form both the view from the manor house itself, but also pleasing views when you are out in the park, because they use these landscapes for walking, for riding, for shooting. It's also a productive landscape, so the timber is very, very important. Yes, they think of it as being aesthetically pleasing, all the trees, but they're also thinking of them in the long term as timber as well. Parks are constantly being replanted in this period. The grass is also a productive part of the landscape, cutting it for hay, grazing it as well. So it's not purely an ornamental landscape, it's ornamental and functional at the same time, which is really typical. This photo is from 1949, Chatteris. It's from the English Heritage photographic collection, which is online, called Britain from Above, and there are other ones of Chatteris from this date on there, which if you haven't seen them, are worth a look. And here's the park, of course, and you can see it is a lot more densely treed in 1949 than it is now. So since the 1950s, a lot of trees have been lost, and some of you may well remember when those trees went. It's interesting, if I just go back to the map, there it is. the Ordnance Survey, not only do they show every tree that's that big, but they also differentiate them by species, which is incredibly helpful. So this little classic tree symbol is used for all deciduous trees, but they also do point out conifers, which is those little spiky ones up there in the corner. And it's really interesting that there are only about 4 or 5 conifers shown in Wenny Meadows in the 19th century. The rest is all deciduous planting, so native trees, beech, oak, ash, sycamore, elm, presumably, although of course they will all have gone. And that's quite, it's not unusual, but in a park created in the 19th century, you tend to find more conifers because they're fast growing, they're evergreen. People really like them in the 19th century, and they plant a lot of them. And it's really interesting that they haven't gone for that kind of aesthetic. They're harking back perhaps to an earlier 18th, 17th century aesthetic of deciduous broadleaf trees, which in the period in which it's created, slap bang at the end of the Napoleonic War period, planting oak trees, planting other native trees is seen as a landowner's patriotic duty. And that's the kind of thought process that people consciously or unconsciously are thinking about in this period. So, context, again, the 1820s, when we know the park is being created, is a period of huge social change. Population is going up very, very rapidly. The towns and cities of Britain are starting to urbanise and industrialise very, very rapidly. By the end of the 19th century, more people live in a town and a city than they do in the countryside. So the countryside is changing a lot as well. In the period that we're talking about, all that of society is usually talking about these two men, either the Prince Regent, later George IV, or Bonaparte. So the Dungardeners in Chatteris would not have been immune from that. They were very much keyed in to that world of elite society, what's happening in London, what's happening in Brighton with the Prince Regent, things like that. The preeminent designer of this period is a chap called Humphry Repton, who dies in 1818, so it's the 200th anniversary of his death this year. He doesn't design, there's no evidence linking him to it, but he does design around 400 other sites around the country. And I've put him in here for a bit of context because Brown is dead. Repton is the kind of man that the Dungardeners would have got in about 1820 to landscape their park. He works for a lot of people on a very similar social scale to them, and a lot of parks of a very similar size. So even though it's not a Repton park, I'm sorry to say, it is Reptonian in its design and its spirit. That's partly because he's the leading landscape designer of the day, so everybody's copying him. And it's partly also because he's doing the same thing as all the other designers. They're working very much in this aesthetic, which results in somewhere like Wenny Meadows. And this is Catton again, which is one of Humphry Repton's most famous commissions in Norfolk. He has this brilliant sales technique where he presents a landowner with a book bound in red leather, so they're called the red books, and they have these little before and after overlays. You lift the flap and it shows what his design suggestions are going to be. So this is his red book for Northreps in Norfolk, which is interesting for our purposes because it depicts an agricultural landscape. Turnips, I think, in this case, with another field behind it. And then you lift the flap, and ta-da! A landscape park has emerged from those fields, which is exactly the kind of thing that the Dungardeners are doing in Chatteris in the 1820s. They've got the house with its plantation belt around the edge, grass, a nice drive winding through it. You can just see the stable block hidden in trees, and it's being grazed by sheep. So if I had time, I should have photoshopped the manor house in there, shouldn't I? That would have been good. This is the kind of thing that is happening all over the country. And it's exactly what's happening in Chatteris too. Repton's really, really famous, so famous that he's the only landscape designer that is name-checked by Austin in Mansfield Park, which he publishes in 1814. So not long before Chatteris is enclosed, the Dungardners are probably already living at the Manor House. And one of her characters is talking about his fictional estate, Southerton, and he's going to have Mr. Repton in to landscape it. That's the kind of social class that the Dungardners belong to. So you could have picked up Jane Austen and moved her from Hampshire to Chatteris and propped her down in the Manor House, and she'd have just got it instantly. And she said, oh yes, was this by Repton or so-and-so? Equally any of her characters. If you think of Pride and Prejudice, for example, I mean, Longbourn Estate, where the Bennet sisters live, Lady Catherine de Bourgh turns up, doesn't she, and says, you have a very small part here, because she's being snobby and mean to Elizabeth. But Longbourn is based on places of a similar size to Wenny Meadows. So that's the kind of Regency context that is being created in. So, there's the house again. So the preservation of earlier features and archaeology is also really important. I mentioned earlier how the lines of trees are remnants of the field boundaries, which are shown on the 1820s map. That's very, very typical in 18th and 19th century landscape parks to find lines of trees. You know, they don't want the hedgerows, but they appreciate ancient old trees. And they want to incorporate them into their parks. Because when you're, well, those of you who have created gardens from scratch will know there's nothing worse than a newly planted tree. It takes years to look decent, doesn't it? And if you're creating a park like this on this kind of scale, then yes, you're planting new trees, but what you really want are loads and loads of pre-existing farmland trees, which you can incorporate into the park. It gives it instant age and instant credibility as an older landscape park, because you want it to look older and 18th century to establish yourself as a member of the landed elite a little bit more. How old are those field boundaries? We know they're there in the 1820s. They could be 16th century, they could be 17th century, they could be 18th century. It's not entirely clear. I think more research will have to be done on the earlier enclosure history of Chatteris to figure it out. But they start to do these kind of piecemeal enclosures, taking bits out of the open fields relatively early on, and they keep doing that for several centuries until you get to the Parliamentary Enclosure period. So the trees that were along those lines, some of which may well still be there, you'll know better than me, some of which have probably gone, but when they were there, they were presumably substantial, mature trees already, which is why they retained them. Now, some of you may have seen this earthwork survey that was done of the archaeology in the park, all those lovely ridges, which are the remains of strip field cultivation from the medieval period, ridge-and-furrow earthworks. This is the earthwork survey, which doesn't look terribly good on this screen. Right, I'm going to turn the other light out. So that hasn't helped at all, has it really? Turn that back on. Which is a good earthwork survey, a very detailed one, and shows how widespread the ridge-and-furrow earthworks are. And of course, as I said earlier, they only survive because it is converted to pasture and to grassland at a relatively early date. But better than earthwork surveys is a photographic technique called LiDAR imagery, which some of you may have come across. It stands for light detection and ranging imagery. And it sends, a plane flies over and it sends pulses of light to the ground, which then bounce back up to the plane. I didn't understand it. But it produces very interesting results because it can see through trees and vegetation to what is on the ground surface below those trees. So this is Manor Park, and this is the LiDAR imagery of the whole site. Now, Oxford Archaeology has only had access to this bit, and you can see all these stripy lines are the ridge-and-furrow earthworks themselves. They have this really unusual reverse S shape, which happens as the medieval plough team, which would have been oxen, turns the plough. They've got very wide turning circles. They start turning quite early along the ploughing ridge. But you can see that actually they extend all over this field here. Here's the ice house on the Hark side here. They go all over that field as well, and it's well known that you can see them over on the wreck too. These ones over here go in a different direction, which is interesting but not unusual. Medieval strip fields are divided up into different furlongs, which will go in different directions. And you can make out these ones over here, either side of the bypass. And sometimes, if the light is right, you can see these ones down here. This is Robin Knight's Lane here. So they are really important earthworks. Medieval ridge and furrow is very common, but not in the fens, where there is very little of it. And this thing over here, this weird circle, is a fence line planting ring around one of the trees in the park. So that's a parkland archaeology feature. And if I flick back to the map, you can see that circle is actually shown around that tree on the map. This funny line here, which goes across the ridge and furrow earthworks, is one of the boundaries on the enclosure map. It's this boundary here, which survives as an earthwork cutting across the medieval ridge and furrow. So as well as all the interesting 18th and 19th century stuff which is going on, we also have the medieval landscape preserved underneath Wenny Meadows. And it's only there because it becomes a park in the 19th century and hasn't been under the plough since that point. As I said, there is lots of it elsewhere in the country. Here's some in the Midlands, where it's very typical to find it. This is medieval ridge and furrow overlaid by the straight field boundaries of the Parliamentary Enclosure Act. You can see how different the landscape is when they are enclosing by Parliamentary Act. They just redraw it. And this is a distribution map of ridge and furrow in the Midlands. This is quite an old distribution map. This is 1946, when at the end of the war, when the RAF had nothing to do anymore, they sent them on an aerial survey, and this has been mapped, the ridge and furrow, from that aerial survey that the RAF did before they were all demobbed. So lots of this is gone now, but what it shows us is that huge swathes of the Midlands, and that applies to Chatteris and this part of the world as well, because this part of the world is more Midlandsy in its landscape characteristics than it is the southeast or anywhere like it. Huge amounts of landscape that was arable open field in the medieval period is converted to pasture in the 18th and 19th centuries. So even though ridge and furrow is really common nationally, locally in the fens, it really isn't, which is why it's really important. And I think that, you know, the county council has acknowledged, and the district council acknowledges its importance. There are other areas of ridge and furrow in Chatteris, but they are nothing like this. They are much later in character. They're very straight ridges, which is characteristic of post-medieval agriculture, whereas this certainly is medieval in its origins. Now, the latest it could possibly be is the 1500s. It's probably much earlier than that. You know, open fields are being created in the late Anglo-Saxon period through the Norman Conquest period, and they've reached their most elaborate in the 12th, 13th century, before the Black Death and population is at its height. So, as well as all the 18th and 19th century stuff, this is a really tangible snapshot of medieval Chatteris, the Chatteris of the nunnery and the church when it's still a new building rather than an ancient one, which is really exciting. And parks are so important for preserving that, where, you know, the rest of the ridge and furrow that must have surrounded the town has disappeared. So I'm going to shut up in a minute because it's 10 to 8. I'm sure you're all dying for a cup of tea. But Wenny Meadows is special. It's the only thing like it in Chatteris, of course. It's an important 18th and 19th century designed landscape. Not only has it not really changed that much since the 1820s when it's first being created, but like the ridge-and-furrow earthworks, there just are not many parks like that in this part of the world, in the Fens. The nearest one, really, for direct comparison, would be Ramsey Abbey. That's the closest one to it. I mean, yes, there's Wimpole, Anglesey Abbey, and those other really big, well-known parks, but they are not in the Fens as such. And there's very little like this around here, which is why it's significant and why it's important. The other reason, of course, is we know comparatively little about it, and our understanding of parks and gardens and country houses is based on Holkham and Chatsworth and places like it. And actually, those places are atypical. They're not representative of the mass of manor houses that are out there in the 18th century. So investigating these smaller design landscapes is becoming more and more of a priority for academics, but also for organisations like Historic England, English Heritage as well, who are putting research into these kinds of places near the top of their agenda at the moment. And of course, it's also really significant because it preserves that medieval archaeology. You know, Chatteris, when you're walking around Chatteris, it's a very 18th, 19th century town, really, in terms of the built environment, the buildings. I know there are much older ones here and there, but it feels very Victorian when you're walking up the high street, doesn't it? But here, we've got not just the 18th, the Georgian, the Regency period, but medieval Chatteris as well. Those farmers, those people who lived here centuries ago. And so it's important for them as well. Right, that's it. Probably going to be quiet.